I rise tonight to talk about what is happening in Syria and the humanitarian crisis that conflict has created. This week we mark a very grim anniversary. It's the third anniversary of the beginning of the conflict in Syria. So we are entering our fourth year, and there's much to cover and much to talk about. I'll be brief tonight, but it's important that we don't forget what's happening to the Syrian people and especially to children in Syria. Over the past 3 years, the brutal Assad regime has unleashed a campaign of unspeakable violence against its own citizens. 9.5 million people now need humanitarian assistance in Syria. Syria's neighbors are overflowing with 2.5 million refugees. This week, Amnesty International and Save the Children released reports that underscore the atrocities that the Syrian people have suffered and continue to suffer. These reports describe the regime's use of starvation tactics against its own citizens. Syrian children dying from preventable diseases, and newborn babies freezing to death in under-equipped hospitals. UNICEF reported this week that Syria is now one of the most dangerous places on the earth to be a child. These unspeakable horrors confirm my worst fear about the conflict, that the most vulnerable and innocent are at the center of President Assad's siege against his own people. I wanted to share the story of a 10-year-old Syrian boy that he shared when he shared his experience with the conflict. This 10-year-old boy, in his account from Save the Children's 2012 report entitled Untold Atrocities, the Stories of Syria's Children. Here's the story, one of the stories, but here it is in his own words. Quote, "When the shells started to fall, I ran. I ran so fast, I ran and I cried at the same time. When we were being bombed, we had nothing. No food, no water, no toys, nothing. There was no way to buy food. The markets and the shops were bombed out. After that, we came back home. To make our food last, we ate just once a day. My father went without food for days because there wasn't enough. I remember watching him tie his stomach with a rope so he would not feel hungry. One day, men with guns broke into our house. They pulled out our food, threw it on the floor, stamped on it so it would be too dirty to eat. Then we had nothing at all." That's the recollection of a 10-year-old boy in Syria. And you go through the report, the catalog really of misery that was compiled by Save the Children from young boys and young girls of all different ages. And every one of them has a tale of horror, just as he outlined. And some are worse and more graphic than what I just read. This report by Save the Children, the most recent report, I should say, by Save the Children, is entitled, quote, "A Devastating Toll," unquote. And it describes the impact this conflict has had on children in great detail. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the full text of this report be entered into the record.
Without objection.
In an article last September in the New York Times, a column I should say, it was an article in the New York Times, in this case by Nicholas Kristof. He said, and I quote, "Syria is today the world capital of human suffering," unquote. Now, anyone who knows the work done by Nicholas Kristof knows he's seen a lot of places in the world where there's terrible misery and suffering. So for him to say that is a substantial indication of how bad the conditions are in Syria. And of course, when he made that statement, it was back in September, many months ago. As bad as it was then, it's even worse now. So today I call on all senators, both parties, and the international community to support the efforts to bring this terrible chapter in Syria's history to a close. Peace talks could be a way to end the conflict. However, I'm disappointed that the talks this past month did not lead to any tangible progress. The Assad regime has refused to negotiate in good faith. Diplomacy is part of the solution, but what we need now is to change the momentum on the ground. Peace talks and diplomacy are fine, but unless something changes on the ground, unless we can take some action or take a series of steps to affect what's happening on the ground, all the talks in the world will be to no avail. The Assad regime and their supporters calculate that they can defeat the opposition and remain in power. The United States should be working with our international partners to tip the balance in favor of the opposition. If we do not, another round of talks will yield the same result: no change. The international community took a good step in ushering through the unanimous passage of UN Security Council Resolution 2139 on February 22nd. With U.S. leadership, Russia and China, who have obstructed other such resolutions, finally joined the international community in demanding an end to attacks on civilians and that the Syrian regime facilitate humanitarian aid to besieged cities, or besieged areas, I should say. UN Security Council Resolution 2139 also condemned attacks against and the detention of journalists. We don't talk enough about this issue as well. Journalists, both international and Syrian, have bravely gone into areas of Syria that many other non-combatants would not dare. And many have paid the ultimate price. So far, 60 journalists have reportedly been killed inside of Syria. These courageous individuals have given us a window into the devastation inside of Syria. I know myself from reading news reports or columns by journalists in this country how much information we can glean from what's happening inside the country, where very few people can go to get information. So we need to focus on that aspect of the problem in the crisis as well. But we shouldn't allow this crisis to continue worsening before our eyes. We need to act. I've been working on a bipartisan basis to put legislation and legislative support behind efforts to bring this conflict to an end. In 2013, I worked with Senator Rubio to introduce Senate Resolution 370, which called for democratic change in Syria, and Senate Bill 3498, the Syrian Humanitarian Support and Democratic Transition Assistance Act of 2012. In 2013, I traveled to Turkey, where I met with opposition political and military leaders to discuss the situation inside of Syria. They asked for aid to help build the capacity of the political opposition, as well as support to the military opposition in the form of communications gear, night vision goggles, and bulletproof vests. A year ago, Senator Rubio and I proudly introduced S-617, the Syria Democratic Transition Act of 2013. This bill would do, among other things, first, increase U.S. assistance to victims of the conflict, both inside of Syria and outside of the country. Number two, support a political transition by authorizing bilateral assistance to build the capacity of the moderate political opposition to prepare for a transition. Number three, provide non-lethal equipment to vetted elements of the armed opposition. And fourth, expand sanctions against the Central Bank of Syria and designated individuals, especially any foreign entities that continue to do business with the Assad regime. After picking up 10 bipartisan co-sponsors to our bill, we worked to ensure that the important aspects of Senate Bill 617 was incorporated into another bill, Senate Bill 960, the Syria Transition Support Act, which then passed the Foreign Relations Committee in a substantial bipartisan manner last summer. I sent a letter to Secretary Kerry earlier this year urging him to resume non-lethal aid in order to help bolster the opposition before the talks in Switzerland. I was pleased to see that aid resumed not long after I sent the letter. We know that Senators Kaine and Rubio are working on a Senate resolution that emphasizes many of the principles that I and others have been pushing for the past 3 years, reiterating the need for unfettered international aid to those in need in Syria and the surrounding region, emphasizing the neutrality of medical professionals and aid providers working inside of Syria. And their legislation would support civilians who have suffered during this conflict, particularly women and children. So I commend Senators Kaine and Rubio for their leadership on this resolution. I intend to support this resolution when it's introduced, and I'd urge all of my colleagues to do the same. I believe we can agree on a bipartisan basis that this kind of horrific human suffering is both unconscionable and unacceptable. And we have a national security interest in ending this conflict and countering the influence of Iran and Hezbollah in the region. It's one of the reasons why it's in our direct national security interest to make sure that we play a substantial role in ending the conflict. Every day the conflict goes on, the regime in Iran is strengthened to export terrorism and all the trouble that the regime imposes upon the region. And secondly, Hezbollah and other extremist elements are empowered the longer the conflict goes. We need to send a clear message from the Senate. We support efforts to bring Assad's tyrannical rule to an end and to respond to this devastating humanitarian crisis, which threatens to destabilize the region and scar a generation of young Syrians. When we talk about this, we're talking now about millions of children. By one estimate, 5.5 million children being adversely impacted. Thousands, by one estimate, more than 10,000 of those children have already been killed. And the ones who have not been killed have seen the kinds of horrors that no human being should ever see, even as adults. It would be very difficult to recover from some of the horror and some of the trauma that these children have seen. It will be with them for the rest of their lives. And we have an obligation to do everything we can to provide pathways to help them, but also to change the dynamic on the battlefield so that those children will never have to see this kind of horror again. Mr. President, just before I wrap up this segment of my remarks, I do want to note that despite the challenge here, the dynamic on the ground that hasn't gone very well for the opposition, and the extremist elements within the opposition make it very difficult for us to be helpful, even when our government is trying. The humanitarian crisis that I just outlined is substantial, and the refugee issue in the region is substantial. Just imagine this. In Lebanon alone, there are almost 1 million refugees in a country that cannot handle that kind of number. In Jordan, the number is just below 600,000. Most people think the number's a lot higher than that in Jordan. Lebanon, as I said, is almost 1 million. Turkey is over 600,000. That number might be low as well. 224,000, more than 224 by one estimate in Iraq. More than 134,000 in Egypt. These are the numbers of refugees in just those 5 countries. Millions of people being impacted. Millions more within the country. If you subtract the refugees who have left the country, and if you subtract out the numbers I talked about with regard to children, just the adults within Syria who have been affected are in the millions. Despite all that horror, I think it's important for us to point out that our government has helped enormously. The Obama administration deserves a lot of credit, commendation for what they've done already. They get criticized a lot, but we should highlight some of the good things that they've done. The humanitarian assistance provided by the administration, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, is substantial and should be noted. It's now more than $1.7 billion. No country comes even close when it comes to the support that our taxpayers and our government has provided. About half of that $1.7 billion has been to help within the country. By one estimate, USAID's estimate, about $878 million is for help within Syria. The balance of that, something on the order of a little more than $850 million, of course, is helping refugees in neighboring countries. So substantial help by the American people should be noted. I think we need to figure out ways to do more. There's probably not a lot of room for more dollars in humanitarian aid, but we should consider that if we can. But there are lots of ways that we can help here without directly engaging any of our troops or any of our military might on the ground. There are lots of ways to help, and we urge the administration to keep focused on a new and more substantial strategy, which I know they've been working on, and they should consult with Congress and work with us as we move forward.